Good morning and welcome to the Gender Education and Development course. I'm very much looking forward to this semester and to being with you all in this course. It's one of my favorite courses to teach and I'm excited about it. I also want to introduce, you will meet with her on Thursday morning, the RA or TA, the teaching assistant Emily Morris, who will be teaching the first class with you because I will actually be at a gender and youth conference in Oxford. But today I want to go through a few main themes that are found throughout the course sessions and that are discussed in the first two readings from Jill Steens and Elaine Unterhalter's book that you have for today's readings. And they're ones that will guide our discussion and reflections throughout the rest of the semester. So to start with, one of the main kind of themes that really this course syllabus is built around is around questions of how gender gets defined and conceptualized. And one of the main ways that gender often is thought about, and in Jill Steen's chapter she talks about this as kind of categories of sex and gender, and seeing gender as difference, the difference between male and female. But this is actually quite an old but still continuing usage of gender. And it also relates to another concept that she discusses in that first chapter, the notion of gender essentialism, of trying to essentialize the kinds of characteristics that we would attribute to certain genders. And this reflects what Unterhalter talks about in conceptualizing gender and using gender as a noun, right? Gender as girls or boys, and looking at those as categories of difference, and that they have particular characteristics that are essentialized to particular genders. But we all know that these concepts have been really problematized in terms of whether gender really is a category that essentializes certain biological sexes. And that's one of the first places we'll start in this conversation is just, even though it's been problematized, how does it continue to get perpetuated in the scholarship and discourse that is reflected in gender and education studies, but more specifically in the topic of this course, gender education and development. And there is some distinction there between, if we were just looking at gender and education, there would be a different set of readings in part for this course than there are for gender education and development. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So that's one key idea, is to think about how gender gets defined both as a noun and then essentialized into certain kind of characteristics, and how that's reflected in much of the development work still today. For example, when we often talk about gender parity in schools around the world and how that's measured, it's measured based on girls' and boys' participation in school. So another way that gender gets conceptualized that Elaine Unterhalter mentions in her first chapter is also gender as an adjective, as gendered types of relationships, as gendered norms. And a third way that it also gets conceptualized that Elaine briefly talks about is more associated probably with post-structuralist thinking, and people like Judith Butler and others, more in the gender and education literature, and one that influences the gender education development but is not as strongly there, is the notion of gender as a verb, gender as doing gender, as performing gender. So these are different categories of ways we can conceptualize gender. And I think importantly for this course, we're also talking about gender as an analytical category, not just as something that is a category and defines people or defines actions or defines things, but is actually a category of analysis, one that we aim to disrupt in its definitions, that we aim to seek to understand its diversity of forms that it takes, that different actors use. So when we talk about different actors, how do governments talk about gender? How do program implementers of NGOs talk about gender? And how do teachers talk about gender? These are all different ways that we will talk about gender as an analytical category through different ways that actors use this concept. The other piece that kind of frames the different sessions for this course relate to the way that different disciplines think about and define gender, or disciplines and fields, really. And this is mentioned briefly both in, I think, the Unterhalter and Steen's work, that gender, of course, has been highly influenced by psychology. So again, these notions of gender differences, gender essentialization, the kinds of categories or roles that different genders have. Jill Steen's work particularly takes up how gender is thought about in international relations, how it is woven into or excluded from the kind of discourse and dialogue around international relations, so how it relates to nation states and relationships between nation states. And a big one there is also just how gender is implicated in notions of laws, but also in interstate relations, so migration being one of them, and many others that we will talk about when we talk about gender and the nation state and transnational feminist movements as well in this course. And then another way that we talk about gender in this course is gender as an analytical category in relation to education. And as I said, this course is gender, education, and development, but in terms of how it intersects with education, we'll look very specifically at how does gender kind of play out in the classroom? How does it get performed? This is where gender becomes more of a verb in some ways, but it also is looked at as an adjective in terms of the gender relations in a classroom between female teachers and male students, between male teachers and female students. And then how do young people perform it? How do they act upon and think about their genders at different points in their life in relation to different kinds of things that they're doing in the school and classroom or in their education? And what are they actually learning about and doing with gender? And then in what ways do they take their learning from their education and employ that out into a gendered world? So these are all questions we'll take up in relationship to gender and education. And in this regard, gender equality becomes a very key concept that will inform much of the discussion in the course and different perspectives that we also discuss from the GAD, gender and development perspectives, the rights perspectives, the capability perspectives, etc. Gender equality, not so much in ways that we look at sameness of categories of difference, like men and women, male and female, but actually in terms of equity kind of measures that are taken to redress inequalities. And those could be various kinds of masculine and feminine inequalities that surface in the doing of gender, as well as in the kind of ways that we measure gender. And we'll talk about those in different ways as we go through the different sessions and how gender inequality gets conceptualized and framed from, say, a perspective of GAD versus maybe capabilities or rights, or post-structuralists as well. And then finally, the theme, of course, related to this course title, Gender, Education, and Development, is to look at not just gender as an individual issue or one that people act on and perform in relation to education and schooling specifically, but as a global issue, one that is taken up as a development issue by global organizations, by national governments, and in local communities, and the different ways that these notions of gender play out in the development agendas of EFA, Education for All, the Millennium Development Goals, and now today the Sustainable Development Goals, and the ways that gender has actually become reconceptualized over time from the early EFA goals of the 1990s to the present ones looking forward to the Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll be talking about the way that gender is implicated in and framed within the development agendas in this course. And those will be discussions throughout every session, but in particular we'll have sessions in the middle of the course around gender and the state and international organizations, as well as the politics and practices of doing gender in international organizations. And then we'll conclude the course as well, talking about gender and the state, or the nation state and nationalism. Including a book by Adele that we'll read in relation to that, as well as transnational feminist movements. So some of the books that are chosen for this course semester are going to focus a little bit more on gender and schooling, and more specifically schooling, but education more broadly. And so you'll get a chance to think more in depth about that. So things like the Jeffrey book, or the Jeffrey book that we have, the Youth Pass, Time Pass, Youth Class and Politics of Waiting in India, or the Erin Murphy Graham's book as well, is very much situated in kind of education. And others, and Adele's work as well, Fida Adele's work is looking very much at kind of gender as it takes place in Jordanian schools. And others like Abu Lugo and Frances Vavras, one of our own faculty, take on both gender and schooling, but also gender in the larger discourse and in kind of the development discourse, and even the larger kind of media and governmental discourses that happen. So I look forward to teaching these various sessions with you this semester, and to discussing these different ways that gender gets conceptualized and implicated in the work that we do in education.